Hi, it's Lori Langford. Welcome to my channel. In today's video, I want to talk to you about the multiple ways to impact contrast in your images using Lightroom. So I'm here in Lightroom Classic, and contrast is a very useful tool to impact the editing of our image. And there are several ways to impact using contrast. It can get a little bit confusing, and I get asked this question all the time about contrast, texture, clarity, and dehaze. So we're going to walk through those today. So to get started, let's first get a real good understanding of contrast. So I created this chart to really help break down the key components of contrast. So the contrast slider in Lightroom really impacts the light and dark areas of your histogram. So it impacts your shadows and your highlights. So if you have low contrast, your image is going to look more flat, kind of film-like. You'll have very even shadows and highlights. High contrast images, on the other hand, have saturated colors and often a darker exposure. So if you think about when you add or subtract contrast, what it naturally is going to do to your image. Now, if we go back over to Lightroom and we look at the contrast slider and you look at your histogram, as you move the contrast slider over to the right, you can see it's spreading the histogram. And that's where it's impacting, again, the shadows on the left and your highlights on the right. So it is going to make those areas darker. Now, the contrast slider is also making global adjustments to your image, so it's impacting all parts of your image and the histogram. So if you use the contrast slider, I encourage you to use it in small increments, very little at a time. Now, personally, I rarely use this contrast slider. I adjust my exposure in my image, and then I work on adding texture, clarity, or dehaze based on what I want to do with the image. So I'm going to walk you through these areas next. So again, the contrast slider is going to give you the option to make some global adjustments, but remember, it can darken or lighten your highlights and blacks. So if we take it over to the left, you can see this gives us kind of a hazy, soft, almost film-like look. So this could be an option if you're editing an image and want that type of look. All right, let's take this back to 0, and let's talk about the other ways to add contrast. So the 3 other tools available are in the presence box right here in Lightroom. So texture, clarity, and dehaze are all ways to impact the contrast in your images. So let's review what those are. So starting with clarity, clarity is one of my favorites. I like the clarity tool because it's working with the midtones of your image. So only the midtones are affected versus the shadows and highlights. It sharpens your image, but it can add noise, so you have to be careful with that. So let's look at clarity when we talk about contrast. So if we add clarity to our image, and I'm going to zoom in so you can see a little bit more on the trunk of this tree and some of the leaves. So let's just zoom in a little bit. And if we slide that over, and if you look at the histogram as I'm doing it, you'll see the histogram is getting a little bit taller. So the midtones are being adjusted, not our shadows or our highlights. So we're not getting too crunched up in the darks here. We're not getting blown out on our highlights, but it is bringing out the details in our trunk here. Now, if we go to the left of the clarity slider, you can see it's softening. So it is reducing the midtones, which is kind of giving us that soft, dreamy look. So that's one way that you can use clarity to reduce your contrast or increase it. So just remember that this one is working in the midtone area. I like to use just a little bit of clarity on images because, again, it's impacting that area that we often don't think about when we're editing. We work on the highlights, the shadows, maybe the blacks or the whites, but we don't do a lot to impact the midtones. And that's where you really get dimension in your image. So if we look at this without that little bit of clarity, we can take it back and just a little pop. It's just a tiny difference, hardly noticeable, but it does make an impact. Okay, so that's clarity. Now let's go over and talk about texture. So texture enhances the details in your image. It works on the high frequency areas. Now, high frequency areas are the areas in your image that have a lot of detail. So it's not a smooth sky. It's going to be details like in a leaf, tree bark, maybe skin. It was originally created in Lightroom for skin smoothing and portrait photographers. So it was a tool to actually smooth texture in an image. A great thing about texture is it does not make your image darker. So it does not impact your exposure or your shadows, but it can also add noise. So let's look at texture. You'd want to add texture when you want to increase or decrease the details. Now, again, with this image, we have a lot of high frequency areas. This tree bark has a lot of detail. The tree overall, the moss in the trees. So working with the texture slider can be really useful with this image. So as I bring that over, you can see how it's really popping and bringing out the details. But it has not done anything, rarely anything, to our histogram. It's just a tiny, tiny adjustment. So this is great if you already have maxed out your blacks, your highlights, and you really just want to add some detail. The texture slider could be the way to go. Now you can also take it over to the left, again, to soften. And the great thing with texture is it is not impacting those dark areas. So if we reduce on the clarity slider, you can see that versus if we do it on the texture. So it's just kind of a preference depending on what you're looking for. All right, I'm going to double click and take these back to 0. Now let's go and talk about dehaze. So dehaze impacts your low contrast area. So your midtones are impacted, and it really was created to add or reduce haze. So think about haze in your image from the sky, from the sun, from fog, weather. It is really meant to help with those things that happen in your image. It also darkens your image. So let's go back and look at dehaze. And we can see now this image, there's a little bit of sky revealed. So let me take the image back. So you can see a little bit of the sky. That is where dehaze makes the biggest impact. So if we slide this over, you can see what it's doing. Now it is darkening the shadows in our image, and you can see it's brought those over on our histogram. So if you look at the histogram and I take it back, you can see how dehaze definitely impacts and can darken your image. But it is a great tool if you just need to remove a little bit of some type of environmental haze. You can do that. Again, you just want to use a little bit of these sliders. Now, the other way is if you want to add some atmospheric haze or something that makes the image look more ethereal, you can do that by reducing the dehaze. All right, so let's talk just a little bit more about when to use these tools. So remember that the contrast slider, the main contrast slider, makes global adjustments to your entire image. So you want to be careful using it. The other 3 ways to impact contrast is going to be using clarity, texture, and dehaze. These make selective changes based on your histogram, and they will do different things. I think the number one thing to watch out is that they don't make your image too dark and they don't add too much noise. Now, the third point to remember is that you can use the mask tools in Lightroom to make individual adjustments to areas of your image so that you can target where you want to add clarity, texture, or dehaze. Now, you do not have to use all 3 in an image. You may use one. You may use one in certain parts of the image with a mask and use another one in different areas. And that's how you can really customize your image. All right, so let's come back to Lightroom, and I want to show you some examples to help you further understand the impact of using these contrast sliders. All right, so let's first look at this image. And with this image, I want to talk to you about dehaze again, just to give you a great example. This image was shot with a lens baby lens, and so those lenses give this little artistic effect on both corners. But we do have some atmospheric haze. It was a hazy morning. And so if I use the dehaze, you can instantly see how it's clearing up the sky a little bit. So if I add, it's making it even foggier, or I could actually dehaze a little bit. So that's darkening my peer, but it's also reducing some of that haze. So it's a personal preference on what you want for your image. Now, if I use the contrast slider on this image, if you watch the histogram, you're going to see kind of how it's spreading it out. And it is definitely going to make everything in the shadows darker. So that's where you have to be careful with that contrast slider. Now, if I reduce this slider, you can see how it's shrinking my histogram, and it's giving us this really dreamy, soft, beachy look, which could be the option that I'm going for as well. You could also do somewhere in between. Now, again, I prefer to first work with the present sliders and then maybe adjust the contrast slider if needed. All right, so let's look at some other examples. We will start with this scene. And for this image, I have the contrast slider all the way up at 99% to show you. So let's take it back down. This is the original image. Again, it was shot with a lens baby lens, so you'll notice some blurring and more creative. But I thought the image was a good one to demonstrate the use of contrast. So I'm going to take the contrast up so that you can see what it's doing to the histogram and how it's really darkening our image a lot. Now I'm going to compare that with a different image. So let's make this image active, and I'm going to compare it to the one that we just reviewed. So let's go back. Let's cancel that. Okay, so we want this image to be our active, and now let's make this active, and we're going to drag this one in. Sometimes this tool works great, and sometimes it gives me a hard time. Okay, so on the left is the image that we just reviewed. This one has the 100% contrast. Now, most of the time, you're never going to use 100% contrast, but I wanted you to be able to see the difference. Now, with this second image, it's the same image, but what I did is I have adjusted the clarity over to 100%. So let's just zoom in on this just a little bit. See if we can get it to let you see kind of the difference here in this image. There we go. So I'm going to take the clarity down so you can see this is the original image. And now if I take the clarity up, and if you look at your histogram, it's spreading the midtones. So it's not impacting those dark areas. So I take it all the way over. You can see what a difference that makes over the contrast. So even at 100%, we are not losing detail in our blacks or our shadows. So they are still have a good amount of detail versus this image. They are very dark, very clipped, and kind of crunched up. You can also see that our highlights have not gotten blown out. It hasn't changed the color tones, and it hasn't darkened our image. So a good way to add some detail is by impacting, or some contrast is by impacting your midtones with the clarity slider. So that's a great example. You can also see in this image, when I take the clarity up, it's really popping the black areas in these nets and really adding some nice detail versus without that clarity slider. Okay, let's look at another example. So I'm going to go back and let's click on this image. All right, so this image I wanted to show because it has a ton of detail. I'm going to go back to the beginning so that we can look at the history of this image. And let me actually click on this one and take you to this point. Okay, so this was the original edited image that I did. And what I want to show you now is we've got this image open. We're going to go in and add some additional texture. So I want to show you the texture slider. I'm going to take it all the way up. So let's look at our histogram. It is darkening our image just a little bit because it's raising, and we can see we've got some clipping in our blacks just a little bit. It's giving us a warning there. So the texture slider will do that. It is darkening, but you can see how much detail it's bringing out in the top of this oak tree and in the trees. So remember, it is focused on the high frequency areas. There's a lot of high frequency in this image because it's almost all texture. If you look at this shrub here and the red flowers, look at that before and look at it with all that texture. So that's a huge, huge impact. All right, so now I'm going to go to, let's go back, and I want to show you this image and compare it with another one. So I am going to make this second image our reference. That's our reference, and this is the image we were working on. And this is the image with all the texture added. Okay, so now on our reference image, I am going to now, instead of texture, I'm going to increase the clarity so you can see how that impacts contrast. So it raised the midtones and it did bring out detail throughout our image. But you can see it's not as much detail in certain areas as the texture slider. And that's because it's adjusting the midtones of the image and it's not really focused on the high frequency areas. So if you're wanting to impact like these trees, you can see how detailed that is by using texture versus clarity. Now in our active image where I can make changes, I'm going to also show you if I use the contrast slider. So if I use contrast instead of texture, look how it's darkening and really clipping our blacks all across the image. So again, I highly recommend to very judiciously choose to use the contrast slider and consider which other contrast slider you want to use to impact your image. So for this image, my choice would definitely be the texture slider as I used in this image on the left. Hope that makes sense. I'll show you again, clarity and how that looks compared to the texture. All right, let's go now and look at another example. And for this example, I have a flower image. So this image, I have increased the clarity. So let's take it over, and this was the image. Now I shot it really soft. I think it was at f5. The intention was to get some of the detail of this camellia flower, but also to really soften the background. So if my goal is to bring out some of the texture and detail, again, I want to think about which tool I want to use. So the first tool would impact, again, just those midtones of our image. And so it won't darken the image, which is a great benefit because I don't want to make this image real dark and black. So if I really increase that, you can see I'm getting more detail in my flower. Let's go to the beginning and all the way back over. All right, so now let me go and we are going to make this, let me go back. I want to make this our reference image. And we're going to drag this one in that has all the clarity. Okay, so on the left is the image that you just saw me edit with clarity. And on the right is an image where I added texture. So I wanted you to be able to see the difference. And this is focused on those high frequency areas, but it has darkened some parts of our histogram. So you can see with that texture all the way over, it is clipping some of our blacks. So we would need to address that, whether we come in and fix that here or fix it with the tone curve. It's really important when you use these contrast sliders to double check your exposure, especially if you're going to print your images. So we can see the difference here. On the left is 100% clarity, and on the right is 100% texture. They're doing two different things, and you can see how this impacted the midtones a little bit. But this one, of course, did impact our blacks, and we had to adjust that. Now, you would hardly ever use 100% of these sliders, but I did want you to see the difference and how it's impacted. Now, a preference would be, or an option that I would prefer in editing an image like this is actually to use the mask. So this image would be a great example. I could come in, if I want to keep this background nice and soft and I don't want to impact my exposure, I could grab the mask tool. I could select subject, and let's see how it does. Okay, it selected more of the subject than I want. So I'm going to delete that mask, and I'm going to try again using objects. And now I'm just going to put an object around the part of the image that I want to impact and let it mask that. Okay, it did a better job. Now I want to add this other leaf. So I'm going to do object again and just add that area. And I should have done more of it. So let's do it again. And we'll just get all of that leaf. I love the object mask tool. I just think it just does an excellent job, as you can see. Sometimes you have to take your time with it, but it does work great. Okay, I'm going to remove this overlay. And now I'm going to show you where I can come down and I can add texture just to this part of the image. And I just want to use a little bit. I don't want it to be drastically different. So that's adding texture. Or I could come in and impact the midtones, which is going to be a softer. So if I take it back, just watch those leaves. It's just adding a really soft effect. It's also impacting our flower. And then if you do texture, it's going to impact mainly the leaves. It's getting a little bit of texture in our flower. Not too much of a difference. So either one could work with this image. I tend to prefer not to mess with my shadows or my highlights. And so for this image, I would probably choose the clarity slider. You can see the difference there versus 100% clarity. We are just targeting this area. So you can see all the moss around is still really soft. In this image, this moss has gotten, it's standing out. It got some of the contrast effect versus in this image, the contrast is still really soft here and we only added it with our mask. Okay, let's go back to one of our tree images. And I'm going to modify this so that you can see. I wanted you to see just the just this image. All right, let's go to this one for reference. All right, so this one has our texture on it. Let's go ahead and get back to our basics. So this is the one that we did all the texture on. And of course, it impacted the entire image. You can see how crunchy all that is. So in this image, our the one that doesn't have any extra texture added, in this image, I could select certain parts of the image that I want to impact. So again, I can come in with our mask and I'm going to go ahead and try, I'm just going to use the brush tool and I'm just going to brush on around this tree because I really want that to be the main part that I add texture to. All right, let me zoom in so that you guys can see it. It's not wanting to let me zoom. Okay, so let's come down and go ahead and add a little bit of texture, just a tiny bit. And now let me see if I can get this to zoom for you. And we'll go back. So you can see the detail added, but I didn't add any extra to the rest of the image. So you can see the difference in the trees here. Let's look over at these shrubs. And you can see they're still pretty soft. They're not as kind of crunched up as they are in this image. So you may want the entire global image impacted, or you may just want to impact one part selectively to really make some details and contrast pop. So it's really, a personal choice and up to you what you want to do. Same thing with our beach scene. So if we go to our beach scene, and let's just bring it back to regular here. And in this image, if I wanted to maybe just impact the sky and dehaze it, I could use the mask and select sky. Let's let it detect it. And then let me get rid of the overlay. I could then decide that I wanted to add some dehaze to the sky. Maybe I want to make it really kind of monochrome, or I could dehaze. But now I'm darkening the sky, I'm bringing out those colors, but I'm not impacting the bridge. So if you remember before, it was darkening our bridge, which we didn't, the pier, we didn't want. So now I'm just adding a little bit of that dehaze into the sky. Now, if I wanted to come in and add another mask, select objects, and I want to maybe impact the water, I'm just going to come in like that, detect some of those waves, remove the overlay, and I could add some texture there to bring out some of the details. Now it's going to be very subtle, but it should give you just a little bit of texture. So this would be before, pretty flat, no contrast image, versus after, using dehaze, adding some texture in the water. You could also brush on and apply some clarity if you wanted, or again, some texture to the pier if you felt like it needed it. So the key things to remember when you are editing is the first slider. Let's go back to our tree image that we started with. Your first slider is your global adjustment for overall contrast, and it is going to spread your histogram. It is going to enhance or impact your shadows and your highlights. The other three ways to impact contrast are texture, clarity, and dehaze. They all three do three different things. You can adjust them a little bit at a time, but you can also use your mask tools to make those personalized adjustments. I'm going to include the PDF of my cheat sheet here. If that helps you, I'll put it as a link in the video. And I hope you will use this to think about how to edit your images and how to make the right decisions when you want to add contrast. Thanks so much. If you like this video, please take a minute to subscribe. Would love to have you follow me. I post videos a couple times a month. Thanks, everybody.